But I loved hearing the music and hearing your poem there. So thanks for sharing that. And I was, your comments there sort of seemed to take us back to some things you were talking about last night. I mean, you mentioned we wear the mask, and then it seemed a lot of your comments last night were about these kind of levels of masks, especially when you think about, you know, that's what your second book is really about. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, ways that you think about poems as masks versus, you know, you usually hear about poem as self-expression, say, or, you know, there's levels of ways in which we reveal or mask the self.
Yeah, well, you think nostalgia continues to complicate our lives, right? Like the way we think about who we are in relation to like where we've been, if that's a family, if that's connected to a particular place, like the way we understand our cultural identity, you know, and I feel like there's something really complicated about our attempts to perform, you know, identity, you know, like what does it mean to be like a real kind of like Wisconsinite, right? Like a cheesehead, right? Like, you know, like, are you drinking beer constantly? You know, like, do you ice fish? You know, like what part of the culture do you kind of take on? I think coming from Compton, growing up in Compton, and now living in Wisconsin for 20 years, you know, like I have all this nostalgia connected to that place. But obviously like my life has changed a lot. So, you know, when I look back and I kind of think about like what to hold on to, you know, am I adapting my memories to the popular culture? You know, like what's my relationship to, you know, NWA? What's my relationship to, you know, Kendrick Lamar? I have something that's much, not necessarily like older, but there's like an intimacy, you know, to the way I understand that place and that culture compared to, you know, these musicians like who are trying to, you know, create like a product, you know, for public consumption. You know, like it's not inward facing music, it's music that's facing outward. You know, so that is a kind of minstrelsy, or it lacks, you know, intimacy, you know, in certain ways. So often I'm trying to reconcile like my understanding of the past and place, but then also thinking about like these public, you know, assumptions, right? Like the way people think about who I am, where I'm from. And I feel like I'm constantly negotiating that, you know, and I think that's probably true for all of us, you know, that there are certain, you know, kind of social parameters in terms of like processing identity, you know, if it's race or gender, if it's sexuality, what does it mean to kind of like lean into some of those things or try and do the work of pulling them apart? Like, how do we find our individuality? But even if you're, as a poet, as an artist, trying to create something to welcome in outsiders, right? Versus creating something that's kind of for insiders, right? Like where you have your own like private mythology. So, you know, the art has to do both things. It has to have that, you know, the emotional intensity, but then it also has to communicate something to a larger group, you know? And I feel like being aware of like what side of the mask you're on, you know, is key, right? That you're aware that you're wearing a mask, right? Like that it's a performance of like whatever, right? Like what is identity, right? Like there's who you are, but then there's what you project. And a poem is kind of a layer of that, right? Like what vocabulary do you use? Which references do you use? How do you sequence those things? We desire authenticity, but at the same time, we realize that these communications are constructed. So then that becomes a question of performance. You know, it becomes a question of how we understand audience, and audience shifts, right? I mean, this is kind of where you are on, or at least like how you understand hierarchy. Like most people code switch. You try and figure out where you are, you know, you try and, you know, understand the politics of the room, and you adjust your vocabulary based on that space, right? Like every room we enter has a vocabulary, right? So it's our work to try and figure out, you know, the way you speak at a club is different from the way you speak when you walk into a bank, right? There's a different vocabulary for that space. So you're code switching, you know, based on that. If you don't code switch, if you think that whatever room you enter should adapt to your voice, that is the definition of power, right? Like everybody has to like work to understand you rather than you work to understand someone else. So thinking about the opportunities in a poem, you know, for things to shift. Every poem should be different if you're imagining the audience, you know, in a different way. So then this creates like opportunity for, you know, some variation, you know, in voice. But then you're essentially creating a series of masks, which I think maybe makes up a collection of poems rather than thinking about what's happening in one poem.
So much to think about there. Thank you. I'd like to invite anyone to jump in here with questions or comments. You know, just unmute yourself when you have a comment, and or you can put anything in the chat that we'll try and get to also. But anything people want to talk about?
I know it's 9 o'clock Sunday morning. Like if you have to splash coffee on your face or something like that, you know, I understand that.
I just want to say that I really love the idea of the fact that nostalgia is getting in our way and is a stumbling block for all of us. And I find that to be true in my life, that even I can hold on to what yesterday was and then find myself disappointed in today. So I really want to think about that more, and also think about the way that poetry and my essays are drawing on a part of the past that I wish to hold on to, maybe desperately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, it's just because of like what was happening in Compton in, you know, the early 80s. And it's connected to my childhood. Like I'm nostalgic for some really vulgar things, right? Like kind of like raunchy underground hip hop, like you know,
You're in Wisconsin, like, and it's
yeah. Yeah. So it's very different, right? So, but I want to hold on to that because that's a part of my, you know, like my past, right? So, like trying to reconcile all the tension in terms of how you understand your life. I remember Trent Lott, who was a senator from Mississippi, is retired some years ago. And, you know, someone interviewed him and, you know, kind of asked him about, you know, his childhood, you know, and he just thought about, you know, kind of casually, it's like, oh, you know, well, you know, Mississippi in, you know, the early 1950s was this incredible place. And wouldn't it be great, you know, if America could be like that again? And I thought, like, I'm not sure if that's, I mean, maybe I imagine like he really had a great experience, right? So he's kind of holding on to that and thinking, well, like what happened to that world, right? Like, why can't we get that world back? You know, so obviously like the conversations that we're having, we're talking about poetry, but like, you know, this is lived experience, right? So like, you know, the conversation about like our past and like which parts of our past, you know, do we address and like what part.
Selective memory.
Yes, which is called growing old, right? Like you, you know,
yeah.
you have
idealization and cherry picking.
Yeah. So then if you're going to write a poem, like what part of the past do you take on, right? Do you know, there's the question last night about, you know, trauma, right? Like, and what does it mean to write about trauma? Like, do you take that on, you know, or do you take on the parts of your past, you know, that were beautiful, that were golden? If you can kind of fuse them both together, you know, which is always true, like the thing that makes us happy is also kind of wedded to things that were painful, you know, in our past. If you can make those two things visible at once, I think that's
Mm.
probably the high art, you know, like you
And
kind of
maybe the
love.
healthiest way to live.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, this is like being American, right? Like you love the person who hurt you, you know, like what do you do with that, right? Like how do you make that work? You know, just because it's your only narrative. So trying to forget versus trying to create some construct to like be whole, you know, even if they're, you know, clear contradictions, you know, and metaphor is about contradiction, right? Like you take two dissimilar things and wet them together to
Mm.
create new meaning, right? Metaphor suggests that there's something absent in our vocabulary, something that we can't articulate. So we have to hold two objects together, you know, that should like fight each other to say, well, like when these two things come together, they can create a new body. You know, that new body is like the idea, the concept, you know, that we express through metaphor. So it's, you know, it's tough work. It should be tough work. And why do it if it's not?
I have a question.
Hey, Heather.
So when you're working on a collection for a book, how do you make sure, or do you consciously think about how you're entering into each poem so that each piece is different?
Yes. I'm always trying to write one poem, and you know, often I think, you know, you take the great poets in history, right? Like they're only known for a few poems. Like they're not like if we're lucky, we'll be remembered because of individual poems, not because of a book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you know, I don't want to sound like a curmudgeon or anything, but I think there's so much energy now directed at books, like kind of getting the book done, that people are blowing past their poems, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what you have to trust is like your obsessions will create some continuity over time. So try and write like an individual poem, right? Like don't think about writing a book at all. And then over time you realize that, you know, there's a through line, partly because like your obsessions instruct you, right? Like there's a larger question you're asking. So even if you, like, I believe in acts of self-sabotage. Like if you do something one day, do the opposite the next day, right? Like
Mm.
tear your aesthetic apart constantly, right? Like just whatever you need to do to try and create like a new voice, a new you know, image system, you know, a new kind of like level of diction. You have to create opportunities for play, you know, every time you sit down, rather than thinking, okay, well, I did that once, I have to do it again. Like do the exact opposite.
Mm.
And I say this because, and this might sound funny, but you know, I don't think we're smart enough to like really make mistakes. You know, like you know, there's like a purpose for everything that we do. Like we just can't see it like on the front end. Like you're not making a mistake. You're complicating like your aesthetic. So, but it takes like some time to really understand what that means, you know. So part of like what we're really doing, and I think this happens at the level of the poem, but then when we're finished with a collection, we really understand it, that it's like a complication of, you know, pattern making, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a poem is always a pattern because we have to make decisions, you know, phrase by phrase, line by line, sentence by sentence, stanza by stanza, you know, like what goes first, you know, where do we end, right? So then if you're putting a collection together, after you've done all the work of the individual poems, well, how do you sequence, you know, like a manuscript, right? Like what's the
Yeah.
first poem? What's the last poem? It's really difficult to see that until you put together a body of work. But if you're sitting down and you haven't written anything and you're like, okay, well, the first poem should be X. Well, no, you have to write all that. And then
Mm-hmm.
you have to figure out, okay, well, what was going on in my life you know, in, you know, the early 90s or like the early 2000s, when I was writing about food, or I used like the color red over and over again, right? Like what does that represent? So your poems are really teaching you, you know, like your poems are teaching you. So, you know, having that mirror is really going to help you understand like the larger arc, you know. And I feel like my adult life has been shaped by like a few questions. There's a question that led me to graduate school. There's a question that led to my first book, and the questions that kind of pulled me through all of my work. But you kind of have to live through that to understand. It's like, wow, I keep revisiting this. Or like when I finished this book and I look back on the last two books, I thought, well, in terms of subject, they're all very different. You know, like one book was about race riots. The second book was about, you know, blackface humor. And then this book is kind of about Compton, but it's also about fatherhood and parenting. And I thought, well, you know, am I doing something different in all of these books? Or is there something that represents, you know, like the larger arc of my career? And then one of the things I kind of process is that I'm really invested in spectacle, you know, like those, the race riots is often about like the crowd looking at the body hanging in a tree or the body on fire. And writing about minstrelsy, I then thought about the crowd watching individuals on stage with those floodlights on them, essentially like dancing for their supper, right? Like the kind of nervous humor, you know, that that's also a different kind of violence. And then with this book, you know, I'm watching my sons grow up, you know, so like I'm the audience, right? And I'm also thinking about my body. So like that idea of spectacle is there, but I wouldn't have understood that at the beginning.
Right, yeah.
So, but your poems will teach you something. You just have to be patient and just kind of like do the messy work just to kind of figure out what you're capable of.
I have such a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I have, am I muted? I'm not, am I?
No, I can hear you.
You can hear me? I have something that'd be familiar to you, I'm sure. A friend of mine gave me this many years ago, and I just kept it. A cheese hat. Jesus. Anyway.
So are you using that for a seat cushion? Like, is that like, do you wear it outside?
You know, I hadn't thought about
uses.
I had thought about a seat cushion, but how would you sit in that? Do you want your legs to go anyway?
That's a personal question. I don't know.
There you go. Anyway, here's my, and maybe this isn't as a question as much as a observation, and do with it what you want. But I read your poems prior to our conversations, and I read these poems and I read them again and I read them again to listen to the language and think about the imagery of these poems, and that was all textual. But hearing you last night really brought the text more off the page for me, if that makes sense. Listening to yours and what these poems are about. I mean, I bring my interpretation to the language of those poems, but I was way off on some of the things that as I looked at your poems, given your the background that you provided for us. And so I guess I become troubled about, you know, without is the author's voice important to a poem, or does the poem stand by itself? Does the text stand for itself? Does that make sense?
It does.
So maybe that's my question in all of that.
Well, this is I think of what I've done so far. This book is much more inward facing. Like I'm using, I mentioned this last night, I'm using the first person in this book more than I ever have. In the past, I've used a lot of personas, or thinking about kind of historical figures as a way of kind of shaping my own identity. And here, I think I worked really hard to kind of like cultivate like a personal or private mythology. You know, there are no, like I had a conversation a few weeks ago about this book, and like there are no notes, right? There are a lot of references in this book, but there are no notes. You know, so I'm referencing, you know, like a R&B group from the 80s called DeBarge, or, you know, a thing that happened to Teddy Pendergrass, who was a R&B singer in the early 80s, you know, where he was in a car accident and was paralyzed. You know, but I'm not writing about him. I'm writing about the woman who was in the car with him during the accident and some of the conversations that happened around her. And part of why I'm doing kind of this like deep dive, like culturally, in terms of things that were significant in my community is like, rather than, I think my education, like I was always working to kind of internalize these other narratives, right? Like reading Chaucer, thinking about Shakespearean references, Greek mythology, as a way to communicate things that I've like lived and felt, right? Like, so like what's common, what's quote unquote like common knowledge if you're an educated person, right? You know, like you think about, you know, Hamlet wringing his hands, you know, or, you know, Persephone, you know, thinking about